Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Gran Turismo has always been a series about enjoying cars and car culture, but we can't ignore the influence that motorsport has had on it. Real-world race cars have always been a cornerstone of these games, dating all the way back to 1997, and as time has gone on, this franchise has only expanded its motorsport reach. Super GT, DTM, World Rally, NASCAR, Le Mans, Formula 1, and plenty more racing categories have had representation in these games over the years. And it doesn't stop at merely race cars that exist in real life. Polyphony has become somewhat renowned for creating their own racing variants, and even completely original designs, such as through their Vision GT initiative. All of this is to say that Gran Turismo loves its race cars. However, even though the series has shone a light on many different racing categories, there will always be some areas that receive less attention than others. Of course, there are types of races which have never appeared in these games, but what I find the most fascinating are the ones that have only ever existed on the very fringes. Today, I've picked out a selection of race cars from these games that stand alone as the only example from their respective racing series, category, or discipline. Through the course of this video, we'll not only cover how the cars appeared in these games, but also their real-life racing exploits and the unique championships they raced in. Being a Japanese franchise, it's no surprise that Japanese race cars have received so much attention in these games over the years. The appearance of its cars in Gran Turismo was a major factor in why Super GT, previously the JGTC, started gaining popularity overseas. However, for this first entry, we'll be talking about a car from a far lesser known championship. The Fuji Super Silhouette series ran for a few years in the late 70s and early 80s. The top class of cars were built to Group 5 regulations, also known as special production cars. In reality, these machines shared very little with their production counterparts beyond some styling cues, hence them being more commonly referred to as Super Silhouettes. In 1982, Nissan debuted a new car to compete in the series, the Skyline RS Silhouette Formula. It was based on the DR30 Nissan Skyline, and as per the regulations, used the same 2.1-litre 4-cylinder engine block. However, like most other Group 5 racers, it was then turbocharged, with two Garrett T05Bs helping to push out around 560 horsepower. In a car that weighed in at just over a ton, this gave it some serious performance. The Tomica-sponsored car was campaigned by Hasemi Motorsports, with team founder and racing legend Masahiro Hasemi being one of the drivers. Fast forward to 1999, and this car would be chosen to appear in Gran Turismo 2, albeit with its name spelled wrong. GT2 and typos, name a more iconic duo. Despite being one of the older race cars in this game, it can still keep up with far newer machines, such as the latest GT500s. Impressive performance and outrageous styling are always a great combination when it comes to making a car memorable in these games. Just look at the Pikes Peak Escudo for proof. However, there is another reason why this car is so fondly remembered in GT2. This car can be won as a prize, which means that you're a lot more likely to encounter it during a playthrough, but it's the event that it can be won from that really matters, the 5th race of the 80s Sports Car Cup. This is a race against sub-300 horsepower road cars on one of the easiest circuits in the game, and it only takes a few minutes. Really, the hardest part of beating it is acquiring the IB license you need to enter in the first place. Through this one race, you can go from your starter car with light upgrades, straight into a race car that's fast enough to beat pretty much any event it's eligible for, including the final championship in the game. Using the Skyline silhouette to break GT2's progression to such an absurd degree was always going to cement this car's place in Gran Turismo folklore. And for a while, that's how things stayed. Despite its very memorable appearance, this car wasn't chosen to return in GT3 or any of the sequels thereafter. At least, that was until July 2022, when the car made a surprise return in GT7's Update 1.19. After more than 22 years away from the series, the Skyline silhouette was back and looking better than ever. Like with most race cars that appeared in the older games, its performance isn't as incredible as it used to be, but it's still decent. The car was also placed into the Group 3 racing class, which makes it quite a strange outlier in a field of mostly modern GT3 machines. The nature of GT7 as a game, with the structured racing groups, and the fact that career mode is now far less important, means that cars like these just don't feel as special as they were in the older games. However, it's still pretty cool to see this car in a modern day racing game in such high detail. When it comes to the real-life exploits of this car, given the relative obscurity of the series it raced in, there isn't a huge amount of information to go on. What we do know is that the car competed from 1982 until the end of 1984 when the series folded, winning 8 races in that time. These Group 5 silhouette cars were known for their very distinctive styling, a result of trying to maximize the car's dimensions within the legal limits, and it's cars like these that inspired this aspect of the Bosozoku subculture in Japan, where people modify their road cars with extreme visual enhancements. I think it's also worth quickly mentioning the Nissan Skyline Turbo C. This car is very commonly mistaken for the Skyline silhouette, given that it was also run by Hasemi Motorsport and in a very similar livery. However, the two are linked mechanically also, as the Turbo C started life as an endurance racing version of the Skyline silhouette. For 1983, it was rebuilt as a Group C car for the All Japan Endurance Championship. It didn't achieve any success though, competing 5 times and failing to finish in any of its races. After that, it was sadly destroyed, but fortunately the Skyline silhouette is still around as part of Nissan's heritage collection. Over the course of its existence, there were plenty of memorable Group 5 races, such as the Porsche 935, Lancia Beta Monte Carlo, Ford Capri, BMW M1, and plenty more. Whilst it is a shame that we haven't seen more of these cars feature in Gran Turismo, I think the fact that this Skyline is still the only Group 5 car to ever appear in this series is pretty fitting. Australia. They've given us many great things over the years. Vegemite, the didgeridoo, that guy who does all the racing game reviews for IGN. But if there is one thing to come from Australia that I appreciate more than any other, it would probably be their Supercars Championship. When you think of big V8s, your mind will likely jump to the US racing scene, but the Aussies have a pretty rich history with them too. The V8 Supercars Championship officially began back in 1997, with Ford and Holden as the sole protagonists. Their big 5-litre touring cars produced a style of racing that wasn't exactly like anything else. By 2000, the series was starting to gain international interest. The previous year, Ford had introduced a new car based on their AU Falcon, which they were hoping to use to dethrone Holden after several years of dominance. This car was dubbed the Falcon XR8, and one of the teams to run it was Glenn Seton Racing. With the release of Gran Turismo 3 the following year, the number 5 car driven by Glenn Seton himself, as well as Neil Crompton for a couple of the endurance rounds, would appear in the game. However, rather than being branded as a Ford, it was instead listed as a Tickford. In case you're wondering, Tickford was essentially Ford Australia's performance division at the time, similar to Holden's special vehicles. They were responsible for the road-going Falcon XR8 as well. Ford bought out Glenn Seton Racing in 1999, and from that point onwards, they became known as Ford Tickford Racing, hence the car being branded a Tickford in the game. Side note, Tickford built a special version of the Falcon called the XR8 Rebel, which was sold with a copy of GT3 and a PlayStation 2. Neat. Also, I seem to remember seeing an Australian advert for GT3 that featured this car and Glenn Seton, but after looking for ages, I can't seem to find it again. Anyway, in GT3, this car is a bit of an outlier. Performance-wise, it's similar to the mid-tier GT cars, think GT500s, Viper and Corvettes, etc. But even though it packs 600 horsepower, its extra weight costs it in acceleration and handling. Being a 4-door saloon car, I guess that isn't too surprising. Its price of 1.5 million credits means that it isn't really worth buying either, unless you're a die-hard fan, but you do have a 1 in 4 chance of winning it from the Super Speedway endurance race. Moving on to GT4, the car would return, and at a much more reasonable price, but strangely, it underwent a change of brand, from Tickford to Ford Australia. It's worth noting that this Falcon wasn't only the first V8 supercar in the series, but also the first Australian car. In GT4, it would be joined by a couple of road cars from Holden, and also a couple of newer BA Falcons branded as FPVs, meaning Ford Performance Vehicles. To explain, in 2001, Tickford was bought out by ProDrive, and its venture with Ford was renamed to Ford Performance Vehicles, hence the removal of the Tickford name as well as any reference to it on the car itself. The XR8 would then go on to appear in the PS3 games, albeit as a standard PS2 model, before disappearing from the series after GT6. As for this car's story in real life, Seton would drive the number 5 car to 5th in the 2000 championship with a single win in race 2 of the 8th round at Winton. The sister number 6 car, which was driven by Neil Crompton for most of the year, didn't perform as well, but it did have a moment of glory when Wayne Gardner drove it to pole position for that year's Bathurst 1000. Incidentally, the number 5 car was in contention to win that race before being taken out by a Holden. It's cool that this car appeared in Gran Turismo at all, but at the same time, I am sad that there weren't more like it. Think about this. Nissan raced in the Supercars Championship with an Ultima from 2013 through to 2019, but it never appeared in Gran Turismo. Bear in mind that those were the GT Academy days when Nissan and Gran Turismo were extremely close. In fact, at one point they even ran a special GT Academy livery on one of their cars. In a cruel twist of fate, it was actually Forza Motorsport where the Ultima would end up, as several cars from the championship have appeared in that series ever since FM3. With Mount Panorama, the famous Australian circuit that hosts the Bathurst 1000, appearing in every GT game since GT6, I thought it was almost guaranteed that more Aussie supercars would appear in some form, yet they still haven't. But not all hope is lost. Toyota are planning to enter the Supercars Championship in 2026, and with Gran Turismo seemingly on a quest to add every Toyota ever made, who knows what could happen? Maybe this story isn't finished just yet. Actually, speaking of Toyota, that's a convenient segue to our next entry. As a brand, Toyota has easily some of the most iconic race cars to this series. The GT1, the Minolta 88CV, and of course, the Castrol Tom Supra. But there is one that I feel often gets unfairly overlooked. Prior to it becoming a Formula 1 event, the Japanese Grand Prix was run for sports cars. Held at the fearsome original Fuji Speedway, in the late 60s it was an all-out battle between Nissan and Toyota for domestic supremacy. The fastest cars were built to Group 7 regulations. Much like the 2000 GT road car, Toyota collaborated with Yamaha to develop their racer, and the end result was known as the Toyota 7. Debuting at the Japanese GP in 1968, the 7 wasn't enough to overcome Nissan and their Chevrolet-powered R381. So Toyota went back to the drawing board and came up with what they called the new 7. The previous 3-litre V8 was replaced with a new 5-litre unit, but Nissan was one step ahead as they had developed a 6-litre V12 for their R382, using it to once again take the honours at Fuji. By this point, Toyota was pretty fed up with being bested by Nissan yet again, so for 1970, they took a radical step. The 7 was upgraded yet again. With the use of new materials, the car was lightened significantly, but what was even more significant was the new engine. Again, it was a 5-litre V8, but now fitted with 2 experimental Garrett turbochargers, making the car capable of roughly 800 horsepower. This made the new Toyota turbocharged 7 easily one of the fastest race cars of its day, and it would go on to be immortalized in Gran Turismo 4 several decades later. GT4 introduced a slew of prototype race cars, including those from the famed Group C era, but it really speaks volumes of this car's explosive speed that, in the right hands, the 7 can keep up with just about any of them. Its short wheelbase means that it isn't the easiest thing to handle, and it also suffers from understeer in high-speed corners, but in a straight line, it's an absolute rocket. The only way to acquire the car in this game is from completing driving missions 25 to 29, aka the first half of the one-lap magic missions. Certainly no easy feat, but this does help to give the car an even stronger mystique. Now, at this point, I know there will be a few of you who think I made a mistake by including this car in this video. That's because it's not the only Group 7 sports car to ever appear in these games. In fact, GT4 brought another one to the series. The Chaparral 2J is a car that I've already covered in a previous video, and it competed in the Can-Am series in 1970 before quickly being outlawed. However, given its radical fan car approach, it doesn't really resemble the Toyota 7 or any other Group 7 race car ever made. It kind of exists as its own separate thing. As such, I still think this makes the 7 something of an outlier in this series as well. Like the 2J, it would then go on to appear in GT5 and GT6, albeit in standard form. Aside from both being Group 7 race cars, the other thing the 7 and 2J have in common is that they're both by far the fastest race cars from this era in these games. In the historic Racing Car Cup event that appears in both GT5 and GT6, they're infamous for being extremely tough opponents that you'll most likely have to try and beat with a far inferior machine. In fact, in the PS3 games, the Toyota 7 actually has a higher performance point rating than even the mighty Minolta. To be honest, the fact that the 2J is so fondly remembered is a big part of the reason why the Toyota 7 gets somewhat overlooked in this series. I mean, the 2J has since returned in GT7 as something of a series icon, in a similar vein to the Escudo Pikes Peak and the older GT500s. However, the Toyota 7's chances of returning I think are extremely slim. The real-life 2J is notable for being a massive what-if situation, as it only raced a handful of times and was never able to show its true potential. The Toyota 7's story was similar, but even more ill-fated. In 1969, Toyota factory driver Sachio Fukuzawa was killed testing an experimental closed cockpit version of the new 7. The fallout from this accident was immense, as Toyota quickly went into damage control. They disposed of any evidence of the accident, including the car itself, and even stated that the cause was driver error, despite witnesses at the scene not being able to confirm that. This all led to a drawn-out legal process that ended with Toyota paying out 61 million yen to Fukuzawa's family. Although the turbocharged 7 was mainly intended to conquer the Japanese Grand Prix, it would never get the chance to. Having developed their own new challenger for 1970, the R383, Nissan made the shock decision to pull out of the Japanese GP as a result of the company's shifting priorities. With their arch-rivals out of the picture, Toyota followed suit, instead focusing their efforts on a planned assault on the North American Can-Am series. However, when testing the car at Suzuka in August, another tragedy would occur. Minoru Kawai, who would emerge as Toyota's new lead driver, lost control of the car with what is believed to be a stuck throttle. In the resulting accident, he was killed instantly. With a cloud still hanging over the project from Fukuzawa's death the year before, the turbocharged 7 was soon shelved, having never competed in a single race. It's quite amazing to think that, had things been slightly different, the Toyota 7 and the Chaparral 2J could have been lining up on the grid together, something that's now only possible in Gran Turismo. Back when I covered the Toyota 88 CV, I made the point of how strange it was for them to include this car specifically in Gran Turismo, given how it never really achieved anything in real life. But arguably, the inclusion of the Toyota 7 is even more bizarre, as it represents one of the company's darkest periods in racing. However, there's still no denying that as a machine it was extremely impressive, and represented an important milestone for the brand. Remember, it was one of the first ever turbocharged race cars, and even though it never got to prove itself in real life, we can be thankful that it's at least able to in Gran Turismo. Rally racing has been a staple of Gran Turismo ever since the second game in the series. Being the most high-profile form of rallying, the World Rally Championship has naturally been the most represented in these games, with many different cars spanning multiple eras. However, this series has also touched on other areas of off-road racing. Rally Raid is one example, with there being a handful of cars that have competed at the Dakar Rally making their way into these games. But there is a form of mixed condition racing that's only had a single representative over the course of this series. Ice racing is a form of motorsport that's not too dissimilar to rallycross, but takes place specifically on ice and snow-covered circuits. The most well-known form of ice racing is the Andros Trophy, which began in France in the early 90s. As the decade went on, it began to steadily grow in popularity, to the point where it started to attract big-name drivers from the world of motorsport, as well as full-on manufacturer teams. One of the brands to throw their hat into the ring was Opel. In 1997, they employed Snowbeck Racing to develop a new machine based on their Tigra. Powered by a V6 sourced from the Opel Omega, the car was also equipped with four-wheel drive and built around a tube frame chassis with carbon fiber bodywork. With Gran Turismo 2 bringing off-road racing to the series for the first time, it was this car that was chosen to represent the Andros Trophy. Of course, the irony of this is that GT2 didn't have any ice or snow circuits, only tarmac and gravel. Still, that doesn't stop it from being an absolute weapon. In real life, the Tigra weighed less than a ton and made around 400 horsepower. These were already pretty impressive stats, but the version in GT2 goes a step further as it boasts well over 500 horsepower. GT2 and getting car specs wrong. Name a more iconic, I've done this joke already. This makes the Tigra easily one of the fastest rally cars in the entire game. If you compare it to the WRC machines, they don't stand a chance. Even the handful of Group B monsters look tame in comparison. And not only can this car do the business on the dirt, but also on the tarmac. It really doesn't get talked about often enough, but this Tigra is so absurdly quick to the point where it can beat the fastest GT cars in the game. However, in spite of its giant killer status, there is just one problem with this car in GT2, and it actually has nothing to do with the car itself. The issue is this: the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak. Effectively, the Escudo, and to a lesser extent the Cultus, was everything the Tigra was and a whole lot more. Another oddball rally weapon with absurd amounts of power and downforce, which could crush pretty much anything else on dirt and tarmac. It also looked completely ridiculous too. Pretty much anyone who played this game knew that the Escudo was king, and its subsequent appearance in every numbered game in the series after this truly cemented it as a GT legend. The Tigra, meanwhile, would be dropped from GT3 onwards and became just a minor footnote in the history of this franchise. In real life, however, it would be far more decorated. Driven by an all-star lineup which included former World Rally champion Marco Elen and future touring car legend Ivan Muller, the Tigra would take back-to-back Andros Trophy titles in 1998 and 1999, courtesy of the latter. After that, it was replaced by a car based on the second-generation Astra, which is possibly referenced in GT2 by way of a racing modification that bears a very similar livery. Beyond this, the Tigra would continue to be raced in the series by various other teams all the way into the mid-2000s. Although there have been no other Andros Trophy cars in Gran Turismo since, ice racing did make its debut in the series, starting with GT4. This game brought snow tracks in the form of Chamonix, and most notably Ice Arena, which strongly resembles the types of compact circuits that were commonly raced on in real life. An interesting detail is that Ice Arena is supposedly located in Canada, something that's also true of Lake Louise in GT7, and in 2003, Canada became the first country to host an Andros Trophy event outside of Europe. By the way, the winner of that inaugural event in Sherbrooke in 2003 was a certain Alain Prost. It is a shame that we haven't seen other cars from this series appear in more racing games, because there have been some really interesting ones over the years. From a V8 powered Beetle, to the Daewoo Lanos, Renault Twingo, and plenty of other weird and wonderful machines. In a sad piece of news that seemed to go completely under the radar, the Andros Trophy actually ended after the 2023/2024 season. Ice racing has always had a unique problem: there not being enough ice. Increasing temperatures meant that it was becoming difficult to run the series over the winter months without relocating it completely. Given its appearance in GT2, the Tigra will remain as easily the most recognizable Andros Trophy car ever. A few months ago, I was asked on one of my Patreon Q&As what I thought was the most underrated car in Gran Turismo, and after giving it a bit of thought, I settled on the Tigra Ice race car. People really need to start talking more about just how good this car is as an all-rounder, and at just 500,000 credits, I think it's a steal. If I'm being honest, this car is actually one of my all-time personal favourites in Gran Turismo. For me, it just has a bit of everything. It's unique and interesting, it looks awesome, and it drives superbly. What more could you really want? In this video, we've already covered cars built for racing series in Japan, Australia, and France. So why don't we add another country to our list? If we head back over to GT4, we can find cars hailing from South Korea for the first time. We have a selection of Hyundai models, including the brand's Accent World Rally car, as well as the extremely obscure Proto Motors Spira, an attempt to build the country's first ever supercar. However, this is only what we can find in the international releases of the game. You see, there was a specific version of GT4 that was only ever released in South Korea, NTSC-K. Functionally, it's pretty similar to the Japanese NTSC-J release, but there are a few noteworthy differences. Aside from the text language, the main one surrounds the inclusion of a few exclusive cars. 2001 saw the birth of a new motor racing category in South Korea, what would soon become known as the BAT GT Championship. The name GT Championship was somewhat misleading, as really it was a touring car series. Although the top class of cars was called GT1, they were much closer in spec to the GT300 machines of the day, having roughly 250 horsepower and a minimum weight of 1,000 kilos. For the 2004 season, Toyota Motors Korea decided to throw their hat into the ring, with a car based on the Lexus IS200. The chassis was actually built directly by Toyota Racing Development, or TRD, and it boasted an impressive aerodynamic package that gave the car a very wide and imposing stance. Under the hood, it packed a tuned version of the 3SGE 4-cylinder from the Japanese market Toyota Altezza. So, even though it wasn't a Korean-made car, the inclusion of the Lexus IS200 GT1 race car in the Korean version of GT4 can be seen as a neat bit of representation for the domestic racing scene. In this game, it is a very decent low-end race car, but it does get outperformed by similarly priced GT300 machines. By the way, ever notice the Gran Turismo logos on the car's windscreen banner and number boxes? Well, the reason for this is actually censorship. The BAT and BAT GT Championship is in deference to the series' main sponsor, British American Tobacco. Of course, this blatant tobacco reference was never gonna fly in-game, so it had to be covered up. That said, you will also notice PlayStation 2 logos on the car, which relates to sponsorship from Sony Computer Entertainment Korea. Interestingly, when the car was unveiled in real life in early 2004, these were Gran Turismo 4 logos instead. As far as I can tell, the car never actually raced with the GT4 stickers, but this does go some way to explain how it ended up in the game at all. Although I can't say this for certain, I'm fairly confident there must have been a promotional tie-up, like what we saw with the AU Falcon in GT3. Anyway, this car would go on to also appear in GT5 and GT6, once again still as a PS2 model. But what's crucial about these appearances is that it would now be available in every region, so for the majority of players, these are the games we actually remember it from. One point of contention about this car is its nationality. Despite being a Japanese-made car, in GT4 it's labelled as being from South Korea. That's despite Lexus being listed as an American brand, as a car's nationality can be different from the manufacturers in this game. In GT5, Lexus would be corrected to a Japanese brand, but the IS200 race car was still stated as South Korean. It wouldn't be until this car's final appearance in the series so far in GT6 that it was finally recognised as Japanese. In real life, this car was driven by Hwang Jin-woo in the 2004 BAT GT Championship. He would win a single race that season, becoming the series' youngest ever race winner at just 21 years old, and would eventually finish third in the championship. At this time, Hyundai cars were the dominant force in the series, with there only being a handful of international models represented. For 2005, the Lexus returned to completely dominate the series, winning 4 out of the 7 races and becoming the first non-Korean made car to win the championship. Hwang Jin-woo would also become the youngest ever series champion, and he would score a second title with the car the following year. As part of my research, I also stumbled across this Hyundai that competed in the 2006 season with a very familiar looking livery. From 2007, the Korean GT Championship would evolve into the Super Race Championship, and has since shifted focus to silhouette stock cars in its top Super 6000 class. I'll be honest, the Lexus IS200 GT1 isn't one of the most interesting cars to have ever appeared in Gran Turismo. A Lexus IS/Toyota Altezza based touring car had already been seen before, and performance-wise it's nothing special. However, this car has to go down as one of the most obscure race cars to ever appear in these games. Outside of South Korea, nobody knows basically anything about this car or the championship it raced in, beyond its brief description in Gran Turismo. Hopefully with this video I've been able to change that, even just a little bit. For our final section, we're going to be focusing on Le Mans prototypes, or LMPs. Outside of Formula cars, these are commonly viewed as the fastest race cars out there. For many people, the first prototype race cars that spring to mind will be those from the famed Group C era of the 80s and early 90s. True monsters that were capable of 240 plus miles an hour on the pre-chicanes Lausanne. But even if we look at more recent examples, we can still find some truly incredible machines, such as the LMP1 hybrids of the 2010s. Porsche's 919 in unrestricted Evo form was even capable of beating Formula 1 lap times at some circuits. But by focusing on just the fastest prototypes, we do risk ignoring the rest of what the class has to offer. The LMP2 category emerged in the early 90s as an entry-level form of prototype racing. The cars were similar to the top-line LMP1 machines, but lighter and less powerful owing to the use of smaller production-based engines. Around the mid-2000s, Zytek Engineering was emerging as a prototype constructor, first in LMP1 and then later in LMP2. They managed a decent amount of success in the latter, including a Le Mans Series title in 2009. With the rules changing in 2011, they had to build an entirely new car to continue competing, and the end result would become known as the Zytek Z11SN. Rather than building their own engine, which they had done previously, they signed a deal with Nismo to use their 4.5-litre V8 that was currently powering their GT500 GTRs. This pairing produced results almost immediately, with Greaves Motorsport racing the car in the Le Mans series and managing to win the LMP2 title, as well as the 24 Hours of Le Mans in class. Just a few years earlier, Nissan started collaborating with Gran Turismo to create the GT Academy competition, where they aimed to take the fastest Gran Turismo players and turn them into real-life racing drivers. So in 2013, they worked with Greaves to enter a Zytek at Le Mans that would be driven by 2008 GT Academy champion Lucas Ordóñez, 2011 European champion Jan Mardenborough, and experienced Nissan Works driver Michael Krum. And it's this very car that would eventually make its way into Gran Turismo 6 through an in-game update in 2015. I guess it's pretty fitting that this car was added specifically for use in that year's online GT Academy competition, although it is of course usable in the rest of the game. As the only LMP2 car in GT6, the Zytek kind of stands in an awkward place. By nature, it's not fast enough to compete with most of the other prototypes in this game, except for a few of the much older models. It also cannot be upgraded, unlike many other race cars. At 1.5 million credits, it also isn't that much cheaper than the bigger prototypes, but it was given as a prize from the aforementioned GT Academy competition back in 2015. So the Zytek doesn't really have much functional purpose in this game, but in spite of that, I really like it. It's one of those cases where a car is appealing simply through being fun to drive. There's a sort of directness to the way it handles that you just don't get with the more powerful prototypes. At some of the twistier tracks, it isn't actually that far off, and given the pretty poor AI in this game, you can often use it to win races you really shouldn't be able to. But of course, we can't ignore the significance of this car in the series as a whole. Touching on its real-life story, the team that included 2 GT Academy graduates would go on to finish 4th at Le Mans in 2013, but they would be promoted to 3rd after a car ahead of them was disqualified post-race. This marked only the second time that a GT Academy driver would achieve a podium here, after Ordóñez had managed 2nd place just 2 years earlier. Now, fast forward a decade and we would see the release of the Gran Turismo movie. This film follows the story of Jan Mardenborough, from competing in GT Academy through to ending up on the podium at Le Mans. However, this film is somewhat notorious for taking creative liberties. For instance, depicting Jan as the first ever GT Academy winner and the first graduate to finish on the podium at Le Mans, despite the fact that both of those accolades actually go to Lucas Ordóñez, who was even one of his co-drivers in this race. But another important point is how the events of the film have been time-shifted into current day, by which I mean 2023. For example, Jan isn't playing Gran Turismo 5, he's playing Gran Turismo 7. And this also explains the change of car, as the Zytek Z11SN has been swapped out for a Ligier JS PX. Now, this isn't technically an LMP2 car, rather it's a track day special that's heavily based on a newer LMP2, that being the JS P217. Regardless, neither the Ligier nor the Zytek are currently in GT7, which seems like a missed opportunity to me. The Ligier because it could have been a cool movie tie-in that's a lot more interesting than just a livery for the GTR GT3, and the Zytek because it represents a totally unique class of car, and one that holds a fascinating place in Gran Turismo history. In fact, by this point we pretty much know that some of the car models in GT7 are just enhanced PS3 models, and given that the Zytek was one of the last PS3 era car models ever created, transferring it into GT7 shouldn't take that much effort at all. Whether it be LMP2, Group C2, or any other lower category of prototypes throughout history, I've always felt like these types of cars represent a massive blind spot, not just in Gran Turismo, but other similar racing games too. If we look beyond merely the cream of the crop, there's a whole host of fascinating prototype race cars that many people have never even heard of, just waiting to get a spotlight shone on them. At the end of the day, it doesn't really surprise me that they get ignored in racing games, as to an extent, the same is true in real life. In 2024, with the hypercar and LMGT3 categories of the World Endurance Championship growing at an astounding rate, the decision was made to cut out the LMP2 class completely. Having been a staple of the series from its inception, it really was a shock decision, but also completely understandable. Despite the important role it serves, LMP2 has always been somewhat underloved. All of this is to say that, without the GT Academy connection, it's very likely we never would have seen the Zytek or any other car like it in Gran Turismo. And now that it's gone, we possibly won't ever again.